This was going to be the best summer ever. I have been babysitting ever since I turned 12 2 years ago. And now I just got hired by the Johnsons, who live in the coolest house ever. It was a sprawling, ancient Victorian, like something you'd see in an old ghost movie. When I arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson hurriedly gave me instructions about bedtime and food, seemingly eager to be out for the evening. Their two kids, Lucy and Max, eyed me warily as their parents rushed off into the night. As the hours passed, Lucy and Max warmed up to me. We played board games, watched cartoons, and had a generally good time. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the children's attitudes changed. "I don't want to go to bed," said Lucy, who was 8. She clung to my arm and whispered, "There's things in the walls." I chuckled, thinking it was a classic case of a child's imagination running wild. "What? Like little gremlins or something?" "That's a pretty creative story, Lucy. Are they friendly at least?" Her eyes were wide as she shook her head. "No. Sometimes they come out at night and try to get us." I tried to reassure her that it was just a story, but her brother Max whispered, his voice trembling, "No, it's true. We've seen them. They have sharp teeth and they whisper strange things." My unease grew, but I attributed it to their active imaginations fueled by the spooky old house. I tucked them into bed, promising to check the walls and make sure that there were no monsters lurking there. I didn't believe for a second that I'd find anything. I roamed the darkened halls to play along with their little game. The house creaked and groaned, its ancient timbers settling into the night. I entered the children's room, and the moonlight filtered through the curtains. I walked around inspecting the walls, knocking on them to assure the kids that there were no monsters. That's when I heard a faint, raspy whisper coming from behind the wall. My heart pounded as I aimed the flashlight at the source, but there was nothing there. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was like a chorus of tiny voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Panic surged through me as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I approached the wall cautiously, pressing my ear against it to listen. I could hear scratching inside the walls, like something was crawling around in there. I was worried that whatever was in there would burst through and try to get me. Terror clawed at my throat as I fumbled for my phone to call the Johnsons. But when I dialed their number, all I heard was static. The call wouldn't connect, and the whispering grew louder, more frenzied. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't leave Lucy and Max in this house with whatever was behind the wall. Gathering my courage, I began searching the room for any sign of an opening. And that's when I saw a loose floorboard beneath the children's bed. With trembling hands, I pried the floorboard open, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath the house. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of desperate, snarling voices, pleading for release. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go down there and see what was hidden beneath the floor. I descended into the darkness, my flashlight revealing a hidden world of terror. The crawl space was cramped and damp, with ancient cobwebs and rotting wood. But what I saw next made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light of my flashlight, were the creatures' tiny, grotesque beings with pale, twisted faces and sharp, needle-like teeth. They were huddled together, their bony fingers reaching out toward me. With a burst of courage, I reached out and grabbed one of the creatures, its frail body wriggling in my grasp. It hissed and screeched, its tiny mouth snapping at me. Suddenly, I was rushed by the rest of the creatures. I crawled out of the floor as fast as I could. I yelled at the kids to get anything they could use as a weapon. Max grabbed his baseball bat from the closet and handed it to me just in time as one of the little gremlins leapt toward us. I swung as hard as I could, and it hit the wall with a gooey splat. Now it was on. The kids hid in the closet as I spent the better part of an hour fighting the terrible monsters. When I finally got them all, I was exhausted and the room was a mess. I let the kids know it was safe to come out again. I held them close, assuring them that the monsters were gone, that they were safe now. The Johnsons returned home later that night, finding us huddled in the children's room. They were horrified at the scene around them. The last thing they wanted was for the rest of the neighborhood to hear about this. So Mr. Johnson quickly handed me $300 for the trouble. This really was going to be the best summer ever.
We used to pack stadiums. Our songs once blared from every radio in the country. But time had a way of erasing glory, like a slow fade out on an old vinyl record. A decade ago, we topped the charts. Now we're reduced to playing dives and CD bars to make ends meet. It had been years since we had a real gig, but the call came in like a lifeline, a mysterious promoter offering us a one-night-only performance at a remote venue. The paycheck was hefty, the promise of a packed house too tempting to resist. We dusted off our instruments and boarded the van one last time. The venue was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. My expectations fell when we came upon the place. It looked like any other dive bar that we had been playing for the past several years. Maybe this wouldn't lead to the big comeback we'd been hoping for. As the first notes of our opening song echoed through the eerie silence of the bar, I could feel the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. The music brought me back to a time when we were kings of the world, when the roar of the crowd was our only currency. But that feeling was short-lived. The audience that had gathered in front of the stage was unlike any I had ever seen. They were all dressed in matching black tracksuits. They stared intently, without emotion, and swayed to the music like zombies. I glanced at the bandmates, and we exchanged uneasy glances, but we couldn't stop the show now. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew even stranger. The audience's chanting became louder and more frenzied, their eyes fixed on us with a strange hunger. It was as if the music had possessed them, turned them into mindless drones. It was during our final song that I noticed something even more disturbing. In the center of the crowd, they began to pile the tables and bar stools as a sort of makeshift altar. A member of the crowd climbed atop it, brandishing a large, ornate dagger. Its blade gleamed and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. What had we gotten ourselves into? The final chord rang out, and the crowd erupted in applause, but it was a cheer devoid of joy. It was a cheer that sent a chill down my spine. The promoter, a tall figure wearing a matching tracksuit, albeit in red, approached us with a sinister smile. "You've pleased our master," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "But there's one more thing you must do." Before we could react, we were seized by the crowd and dragged toward the altar. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. We had stumbled into something far more sinister than a simple gig. This was a ritual, a cult, and we were the unwitting sacrifices. I tried to fight back, but the hands that held me were too many of them. The drummer and bassist were similarly overpowered. We were helpless as they forced us onto the altar, restraining our arms and legs with rope. The crowd chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The promoter raised the ornate dagger high above his head, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical zeal. Clearly, we were not the first to be brought here, and we wouldn't be the last. Just as the dagger descended, front door burst open, and two men rushed in with shotguns. One man fired his into the ceiling to get the attention of the crowd. Their chants turned into cries of fear and confusion. They aimed at the crowd, instructing them to back off. As the crowd parted, the men made their way to us. One of them worked at undoing our restraints, while the other held the cult members at bay. But one man can't hold back an entire crowd, even if he has a shotgun. Just as we were getting free, the crowd flanked the other man, taking him down. We didn't have much time. My bandmates, our last remaining savior, and I ran for the front door. Outside, our van was already gone. The cult had already been busy covering their tracks. Luckily, the two men had arrived in a pickup truck. My bandmates and I piled into the back as the man got in front and peeled off on the old gravel road. When we finally made it back to civilization, we were able to pull off and speak to our savior. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He explained that he and his brother had been born into that cult. Their parents were members, and they grew up witnessing atrocities that I can't even begin to imagine. The cult was constantly moving, as staying in one spot too long would surely mean that their crimes would be discovered. When the brothers grew up, they realized that they lived with monsters. They escaped and spent years trying to track them down and put an end to their reign of terror. As dawn broke over the horizon, we made our way back to our homes, but life for us would never be the same again. In the years that followed, we never spoke of that night, as if the memory itself were a curse. We went our separate ways, our dreams of fame and glory shattered by the horror we had witnessed.
My life was ordinary, or at least it used to be. I was just another face in the crowded city, going about my daily routine without a care in the world. But all of that changed when I got evicted and had to move into a rundown tenement in a bad section of town. The place was a flophouse. It looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The neighborhood itself wasn't much better. There seemed to always be homeless people right outside the building that would swarm you, asking for change anytime you came or went. But the rent was cheap, and in this city, cheap was the only way to survive. So, I signed a lease without a second thought. It didn't take long for the oddities to surface. My landlord, Mr. Layton, was an enigmatic figure. He had a gaunt, pallid complexion and cold, calculating eyes. He spoke in a low, almost whispery voice, as if he were afraid of being overheard. His whole demeanor made me feel uncomfortable to be around him. The other tenants in the building were equally peculiar. They kept to themselves, rarely making eye contact, and always seemed to be in a hurry to get inside their apartments. But what disturbed me the most was that there were several nights where I could swear that I heard faint, muffled screams coming from somewhere in the building. At first, I brushed it off as just my imagination, but after repeatedly hearing it, I knew that it couldn't just be in my head. As the weeks went by, it became increasingly obvious that something was terribly wrong here. That large stain on the hallway carpet, could it be blood? And then there were the strange packages that Mr. Layton would receive, large, heavy boxes that emitted an unsettling metallic odor. Was I looking too much into all of this? My curiosity got the best of me one night when I decided to do some digging. I started with a simple internet search of the building, and what I found sent a shiver down my spine. It seems it had always been in Mr. Layton's family. His grandfather was the original owner back in the 20s, and the building always held a dark history. There were reports of missing persons and unexplained deaths dating back decades. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront Mr. Layton to find out the truth about what was happening in this building. And so, one evening, I gathered my courage and knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, his cold eyes fixing on me with a predatory gaze. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked in that unsettling whisper. I cleared my throat, my palms sweaty with anxiety. "I was just wondering about the history of this building," I stammered. "There are rumors, you know." Mr. Layton's lips curled into a sinister smile. Rumors, you say? I'm afraid I have no earthly idea what you're talking about. Perhaps you're letting your imagination get the best of you. And with that, he slowly backed into the apartment, closing the door. His piercing gaze never left mine, but I knew better. I knew that I was onto something, and I couldn't back down now. I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. That night, I decided to do some more digging. I waited until after midnight when I was sure Mr. Layton was fast asleep, and I ventured into the basement. It was a dark, damp place, littered with discarded furniture and forgotten relics of the past. As I rummaged through the clutter, I stumbled upon a small, locked door hidden behind a pile of old mattresses. It must have led to some sort of sub-basement. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lock, using one of my hairpins to try and pick it. When it finally gave way, I descended into the abyss below. The cellar was a nightmare, a macabre chamber of horrors that sent a shockwave of terror through my entire body. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding a gruesome collection of trophies, human skulls, bones, and jars filled with unidentifiable body parts. My stomach churned and bile rose in my throat. And then, in the center of the room, I saw at the source of the screams I had heard at night. It was a makeshift holding cell, a cage barely large enough for a person to stand. Inside, there was a woman, emaciated and terrified, her eyes wide with fear. I rushed to her side, fumbling for the key to the cell. When I unlocked the door, she collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I helped her out of the cellar and into the safety of my apartment. She told me her horrifying story, how she had been lured into the building by promises of cheap rent, only to be imprisoned in the cellar, subjected to unspeakable horrors at the hands of Mr. Layton. We called the police, and they arrived in force, storming Mr. Layton's apartment and taking him into custody. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth about what had been happening at this building could no longer be denied. But as Mr. Layton was led away in handcuffs, he turned to me with a chilling smile, his cold eyes locking onto mine. "You can't stop what's already been set in motion," he whispered. I couldn't help but shudder as the implications of his words sank in. What had I uncovered, and what darkness had I unwittingly unleashed? The truth about my landlord was far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. Sometimes, as I lay awake at night, those words echo in my mind. What could it possibly mean? I dread the day that I find out.